Con ustedes, el doctor William Bradford Wilcox. Un aplauso, por favor.
Thank you for having me here at this incredible Congress. I'm speaking today about marriage as the bedrock of civilization. And I come to you from Thomas Jefferson's Virginia in the United States. Jefferson is famous for founding my university, the University of Virginia, and for designing his magnificent Monticello, that home you can see up on the screen. But he's famous even more for something else, and that is for being the author of the Declaration of Independence, where he penned those words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as core values for my own American civilization. So I want to reflect today, this afternoon, on how your neighbor, the United States, is doing when it comes to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I must confess that I come today bearing bad tidings, because this Jeffersonian vision is in trouble in my civilization. When it comes, for instance, to life, what we are seeing is that scores of men and women across America are turning to drink, to pills, or to the barrel of a gun, dying what are called premature deaths of despair in record numbers in our country in recent years. Or when it comes to liberty, economic liberty especially, what we're seeing is that outside of the gilded suburbs where wealthy Americans make their homes, we know that the American dream is out of reach for too many Americans, millions of Americans, in fact. Or consider the pursuit of happiness. And here I'm just going to pause for a second and ask you to raise your hand if you'd like to be happy. Okay, so the vast majority of folks here want to be happy. But what we're seeing in my country is that happiness is falling in America. Scores of Americans are not realizing that classic pursuit of happiness in my country. And the biggest factor here is not what tends to dominate our public conversations in the media, in the academy, and in politics. It's not primarily about poverty. It's not about failing schools. It's not about taxes. And it's most certainly not about immigration. It's about something else playing out in the United States, and that is what I call the closing of the American heart. The American heart is closing when it comes to love, when it comes to dating. You can see here that dating has fallen by about 50% since 1980. When it comes to marriage, the marriage rates come down by about 60% since 1970. And fertility, of course, has hit a record low in recent years, both in the US and in Mexico. And in fact, this brings me to the next slides, which are really more relevant for this audience here in Mexico. Because what we're seeing, what we're witnessing is a kind of closing of the Mexican heart as well on the family front. When you look at marriage trends, we can see that the marriage rate has fallen by almost half in Mexico since 2000. And we see also when it comes to fertility that in this country you are now well below replacement fertility, which is 2.1 babies per woman on average. So again, this country, Mexico, is not replacing itself when it comes to fertility. And so we're seeing then again this closing of the American heart, not just in the US, north of the border here, but also in Mexico as well. Of course, there are plenty of voices in the culture who don't think any of this is a problem. I'm thinking, for instance, of the NYU sociologist Eric Klinenberg, the author of a book called Going Solo, who could not muster a negative word in the New York Times when he was talking about these family dynamics. He said, quote, "For young professionals, it, being single, is a sign of success and a mark of distinction, a way to gain freedom and experience the anonymity that can make city life so exhilarating. For someone who's recently divorced, it, being single, is a way to reassert control over your life." Ah, yes, success, control, freedom from family, these are the keys to meaning and happiness. This, of course, is increasingly the contemporary wisdom that we see around us in the culture today. But in a context where more and more societies are marked by rising economic inequality, in a society where too many of us are glued to our screens, addicted to the electronic opiates that make so many of us anxious and depressed, in countries where community is crumbling and loneliness is rising, and in a culture where fewer and fewer norms ground and guide our lives, it's in this economic, it's in this technological, it's in this social, and it's in this cultural context that I would submit to you this afternoon that marriage and family don't just matter for us today, but that they matter more than ever in today's world. They matter more than ever in today's world. And so we can consider, for instance, one story here to kind of illustrate the point in part, and that is the story of Scott. By the standards of success in today's world, nothing should bother Scott, who's in his mid-30s and unmarried. He's got a college degree from Clemson University, an engaging career as a military contractor, a house of his own, and he makes more than $100,000, okay? But these educational and professional accomplishments are not enough for him. He said, "You know, I've got degrees on my wall, I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end," is what he said to me. Scott feels alone and at sea on many a day. Quote, "I have to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize that I am alone. I have nobody." And Scott is struggling with a toxic mix of loneliness, meaninglessness, and sadness. Now, to be sure, we know that there are some singles who are flourishing, and there are married folks who are miserable. But the dramatic growth that we are seeing in young men and women like Scott, in the main, is a worrisome trend. A worrisome trend. And by contrast, when we look at men and women like Kate, a married mother of 3, we see that they're doing comparatively better than the Scotts of this world. On the one hand, she acknowledges that she had more free time and more opportunities to do fun things, from window shopping to eating out at fancy restaurants when she was childless. Today, her life is, quote, "harder now that I have kids." A crying baby, a dirty kitchen, or a toddler tantrum disrupts her day on a regular basis. But marriage and motherhood have also left her feeling more compassionate, more charitable, and more connected. Life is, quote, "fuller because it's shared with my husband and kids," she told me, adding, quote, "I think there's a deeper fulfillment there." Kate's story is consistent with the way in which the late, great St. John Paul II taught us that happiness comes not by pursuing it directly via pleasure, success, or flying solo, but by making a gift of ourselves to our communities, to our friends, and to our family. And that's because we are, as Aristotle said, social animals. We're hardwired to connect. And so our ties with others especially friends and family, end up being crucial to our welfare. And it is these ties, not how much money you have or the degree on your wall, that are most conducive today to forging a meaningful and happy life. So what's the social science evidence to support the claims that I'm making here at this Congress in this afternoon? When it comes to what we call, again, deaths of despair, where more and more Americans, particularly working class men, are killing themselves by drink or by drugs or by suicide, what we see in new work done by the Brookings economist Jonathan Rothwell is that when he looks at the predictors geographically across the US, what he finds is kind of the number one factor driving this trend is whether or not you're married, whether or not you've kind of put a ring on it and have been able to sustain that ring on your finger, both literally and metaphorically. Or what about the American dream? This idea that in America you kind of can come to our country, you can be growing up poor as a child, but then rise into adulthood, into affluence, into riches. Again, the classic rags to riches American dream is what I'm talking about right now. We see from the work of Raj Chetty, an economist at Harvard University, and his colleagues, is that, again, the number one factor at the community level predicting whether poor kids rise into riches or stay poor is whether or not they're living in a community with lots of two-parent families. So again, we kind of can see how much marriage and family matter for fostering mobility in America. And here we can kind of illustrate this point by thinking about what is the state, the number one state in America for mobility, for poor kids to rise into riches as adults. And that state here is up on the screen. And if you've been traveling at all in the States, you probably recognize that this is Utah, which has the number one share of kids being raised today in America in married families. So it kind of just shows us visually how there's a strong connection between the health of the American dream and the health of the family. And then finally, that pursuit of happiness that I touched on earlier today. What we can see in the work of Dr. Sam Peltzman at the University of Chicago, again, is that the number one factor that accounts for declining happiness in America is the fact that fewer Americans are married today in the US. And again, what I'm suggesting is it's not just that marriage matters, but that it matters more than ever, particularly in a context where we're seeing this digital revolution unfold, making us more distracted by our devices and more isolated from in-person social activities. So we can see here on this particular slide, or slides, is that happiness is down for everybody in America in the recent years. But it's particularly down for Americans who are not married, who are either divorced or even more, never married in this particular slide. And it's kind of showing us, again, in the US, that marriage matters more than ever when it comes to that classic pursuit, the pursuit of happiness. It also is protective, increasingly protective in the United States against suicide. We can see here some work done by Sam Wilkinson, a psychiatrist at Yale University. And what this is showing us is that the married risk of suicidal thoughts is not growing in recent years. But the risk of suicidal thoughts is growing for unmarried Americans. So it suggests again that marriage matters more than ever. And we haven't yet kind of explored this issue of marriage's impact at the societal level here in Mexico, but it's certainly, I think, sobering and telling that we see dramatic increases here in Mexico in recent decades in the same time when we're also witnessing this closing of the American heart playing out in Mexico. So why is it then that marriage is a bedrock of civilization? Why is it that marriage is described as a bedrock of civilization? Here I'm drawing upon the work of the Harvard anthropologist Joseph Heinrich, talking about marriage as a bedrock of most civilizations. And he says that in most civilizations, marriage, quote, plays a central role in organizing family life, promoting human flourishing, and maintaining social order. How does it do this? It does this by binding men to the children that they father. It does this by stabilizing romantic relationships of adults. It does this by bridging the gender divide between women and men. It does this by endowing the lives of women, and especially men, with a deeper sense of meaning, direction, and purpose. And above all, it does this by providing the ideal context for the bearing and rearing of children. And again, my view is that marriage is a harbor today like no other in the world, as more of us are feeling alone and at sea in the contemporary culture. But if marriage is so important, if it's such a bedrock, why is it crumbling to some important extent, both in the United States and then also here in Mexico? I think there are 5 key things that are worth thinking about in terms of understanding why marriage has lost ground, again, both in the US and probably in Mexico as well. The first thing that we're seeing in the United States is what I call a kind of male malaise, where our boys are floundering more in school and college, and then as they enter into manhood are more likely to be floundering in the workplace, not doing so well at work. What we're seeing in the US, for instance, is that about 1 in 5 guys are not employed full-time, and 1 in 4 guys who don't have college degrees are not employed full-time. And that matters because it's still the case today in 2026 that women cotton to men who are decent providers. And when men are not doing well in the workplace, women are less likely to marry them in the first place, and they're more likely to divorce them in the second place. So again, this male malaise is part of the story here. But there's also, and this is the second factor, what I call a kind of minus mindset. A minus mindset, where we're hearing online and in the media and in the academy that what matters in life is not marriage and family. What matters in life, we are told, is building your own brand, focusing on a rewarding career, having fun, and above all, being free from the encumbrances of family life. In a sense, mammon today is what matters and not marriage. So from the left, really targeting women, we have messages like this in Bloomberg, one of our leading financial news services in the States, suggesting actually falsely that the path to prosperity for women runs away from family and not towards family. We have messages like this in the New York Times telling us that married, heterosexual motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. Again, kind of discounting the value of marriage and family from the left for young women. But we're also now seeing kind of a message from the right, targeting young men. Here, of course, we have Andrew Tate telling us that there is 0 statistical advantage for men when it comes to marriage and family. So again, many voices are kind of discounting the value of marriage and family and advancing this kind of minus mindset. And I see it in my students at the University of Virginia. For instance, Holly, a recent graduate of my university, she said students are definitely more focused on their education and getting their career started than getting into a serious relationship. Basically, the thought process is relationships and love are risk, but you always have your career and success to fall back on. Okay, so pretty confident about the role of career and success as the grounds for a good life from her perspective. And then the third thing that we're seeing play out is this digital revolution, where our screens and our devices are degrading our social life and our social skills, driving, for instance, dating down, really across the globe, where the algorithms are dividing young men and young women from one another, as this slide here indicates, where a lot of young men are moving to the left ideologically, and some young men are moving to the right, which makes it harder for them to find common ground in terms of socializing, dating, and forming a family. And we see in the US that about 2 out of 3 young adults today who are eligible to date are not dating, in part as a consequence of the fallout of this digital revolution. The fourth factor that we see playing out is what we can call the capstone model of marriage. It's this idea you have to get all of your ducks in a row before you get serious about marriage. You have to get all of your education done. You have to get launched in a great career and maybe even have enough money to buy a decent home. This is kind of the idea behind the capstone model of marriage. And so it helps us to understand why we're seeing the typical age at first marriage in the US is now moving to about 30 years old. 30 years old. And the problem, though, with this development is that it's leaving more and more 30-somethings without a spouse, because they've been kind of waiting into their late 20s or early 30s to find the right person, the perfect person, yet it just becomes more and more difficult as they wait until about 30. So I spoke to a young woman, for instance, in the Rocky Mountains near Denver, and she said kind of that she laments her approach to waiting until about 30 to find a husband because she hasn't found him. She said, I was encouraged to kind of see the world, focus on work, and do all these other things, and don't get attached to anyone too quickly in my 20s. But I look back on that advice, and I'm like, if I could do it again, I would actually focus on finding a husband a little bit earlier. So again, this is an expression of the challenge of waiting until your late 20s or early 30s to find your spouse. You can often end up without a spouse in today's world. And then the final thing that I'll mention here is just the increasingly secular turn of American life. We're seeing more and more nuns, and that is not the N-U-N-S's, but the religious nuns who have no religious affiliation in America today. And this is important because we know that religious Americans, I think probably true for Mexico as well, are markedly more likely to be married than their fellow adults who are not religious. It's also important because we see that religious Americans are significantly more likely to be happily married than their fellow Americans who are not religious. And then finally, they're also more likely to be stably married. They're more likely to steer clear of divorce court. This is research from Tyler Vanderweel, a professor at Harvard, and he finds that women who are church-going are about 47% less likely to get divorced than their female peers who are not church-going. So we've learned today how and why the American heart, maybe also the Mexican heart, is closing to some of the most important goods in life: love, courtship, marriage, and family. It's a sobering story, but I don't want to end with just the bad news. I want to kind of give us a sense of how we can kind of take steps, both here in Mexico and in my country, to renew what we know as the civilization of love. What are some steps that we can take to do this? And I've got 5 steps to conclude. So the first thing that I would say is that given the importance of work in affording men a sense of self-worth and improving their marriageability, we must turn today's lost boys into tomorrow's male breadwinners. We need to advance economic policies that make a family wage possible and encourage our schools, colleges, universities, and trade schools to do a much better job of educating our boys and young men to make them capable of thriving as male breadwinners. So this is the first step that we need to be thinking about in terms of reviving male breadwinning. The second step that we need to take is to understand and appreciate that for too long our culture has sold us the lie that the path to a meaningful and happy life runs away from family. Because the science actually is telling us that it runs right to the family. The happiest men and women in America today are those who are married with kids. And at hazard guess, the same thing is true here in Mexico. So we need to do a better job in the media, online, and in our schools of underlining the truth, the goodness, and the beauty of a family-focused life. Then the third thing that I would say is we need to appreciate how much things like pornography, social media, gaming, and other digital distractions have exacted a devastating toll on our real-world relationships. We've got to figure out how we can embrace a spirit of technological asceticism that minimizes the power of our devices and maximizes our time with friends and family in person. We must also use the power of public law to curb the power of big tech, of course, in our lives, especially in our kids' lives here in Mexico. And then fourth, in the face of plummeting marriage rates and falling fertility, we must rethink our devotion to the capstone model of marriage. The science tells us that actually getting married younger, kind of broadly speaking in your mid-20s, tends to maximize your odds of forging a faithful, happy, and fruitful marriage. So it's time to abandon the capstone model of marriage and make marriage the cornerstone, again, of young men and young women's lives. And then finally, I can't tell you how many young men and young women today are hungry, even desperate, for direction and guidance when it comes to dating and marriage and family life. There's a real opportunity, I think, here for churches and other religious groups to engage young adults with a message focused around opening up the Mexican heart, equipping them with the virtues they need to date, and venues where they can meet the potential love of their life. The time is now to seize that opportunity, and this is why I'm so happy to see this Congress as a sign of efforts in this direction. So taking steps like these could not be more important, because equipping men and women to open their hearts to the vocation to marriage and family and preparing the next generation to do likewise is the best pathway to reviving the bedrock ideals at the heart of our civilizations, especially the pursuit of happiness today. And this is why the work that you're all doing could not be more important for the future of this great nation, Mexico. So thank you. Oh, gracias.